today's seminar speaker, Andrew Campbell, who will be presenting his talk on developing the Western U.S. power grid through markets. Mr. Campbell is the Executive Director of the Energy Institute at COST at the University of California, Berkeley, and he serves as the governing body member of the Western Energy Imbalance Market. So you may have to explain to us what that is later. At the Energy Institute, he serves as a bridge between research community and business and policy leaders on energy economics and policy topics. Prior to UC Berkeley, Mr. Campbell worked for residential energy management company Tendril and grid sensor provider Sentinel Energy. For 5 years, Mr. Campbell served as an advisor at the California Public Utilities Commission. There, he led successful efforts on grid modernization and data access, electric vehicle charging, demand response, and dynamic pricing. Mr. Campbell also worked in Citigroup's Global Energy Group and as a reservoir engineer with ExxonMobil. Mr. Campbell earned a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering and economics from Rice University and a master's degree in public policy from Harvard Kennedy School. So please join us in welcoming Mr. Campbell.
That introduction, and thanks to Professor Kendall for inviting me to speak as part of this seminar. I'm happy to get to interact with the graduate group here. I think I'm happy to kind of take questions at any time during my remarks. I think also I'll just say is it's something I appreciate in looking at your speakers over time in this program is it's a mix of people who are kind of from academics and as well as practitioners. I'm sort of some of both. I'm really think of myself as a practitioner. I'm at UC Berkeley, work with academics every day in, day out, but I really, my own background is, as I'll discuss, and even my role at the Energy Institute is much more thinking about practice, kind of putting ideas into practice, working with industry, working with the public sector. So first, I'll just kind of say a bit about kind of my career path so far. Many more things to come. Yet to see what those are. But first, I'm from Houston, Texas. This is the Houston skyline. This is a picture with my daughter several years ago. And growing up in Houston, spent countless hours wandering the bayous and creeks of kind of the Gulf Coast, similar to Louisiana, very swampy place. It doesn't look like much, but that's Buffalo Bayou and that little crevice there. But I very much became drawn to the natural environment, and I started identifying myself as an environmentalist in college. Among other things, I became president of the environmental club. But I can also confidently say that my interest in energy comes from being from Houston, Texas. In Houston, energy is everywhere, especially oil and gas. Especially when I was there, it was oil and gas. And the city's fortunes and the cities of families and friends kind of rose and fell with the West Texas Intermediate crude oil price. Something that in Houston, you just kind of that rattles off your, off the tongue. But also in being in Houston, you was exposed to how international the energy industry is. I mean, I had friends whose parents would go off to Saudi Arabia for periods of time, Venezuela for periods of time. It was just extremely international place. And I think just through my exposure there, the industry sounded very exciting. And also it sounded very important, just something that mattered in the world. And so that's part of what led me to get degrees in chemical engineering and economics. I understand a number of folks here have engineering and other science backgrounds. And while I kind of don't work in those roles now, I like to kind of bridge those gaps. Hopefully we can connect around some of those bridges. But I always wanted to combine my interest in energy with my interest in the environment. But I'll say it took me a few years to kind of get to bringing those things together. Kind of where I started my career, my first internships, I was as a chemical engineer working for an engineering firm, helping to design upgrades to this refinery, Flint Hills Resources Refinery, Corpus Christi, Texas. This is a very typical Gulf Coast scene. Many scenes like this, flat place, lots of water, and lots of industrial infrastructure. But I was designing heat exchangers and pumps and just very kind of technical, getting sort of technical training in that area. I kind of continue to be interested in oil and gas and energy and work in the technical side of it. After college, worked for not the place where you necessarily expect the president of the Environmental Club to go to work, ExxonMobil. These are two drilling rigs. Another very common Texas scene, like literally you can just drive down the freeway in Texas, especially at night. You see these kind of lit up towers, and like those are drilling rigs. So I was in the upstream, which in oil and gas lingo, that's kind of the exploration and development of oil and gas. And I'd say I went to work for Exxon for a reason which actually I think did pay off. It was a firm known for training people. And early in my career, I just wanted to learn. Like I wanted to have an impact, still want to have an impact on the world, but I also sort of saw the early part of my career as a time to kind of just go places where they were going to teach me a lot. And they taught me a lot because they expected me to stay there a long time. I didn't stay there, but I did learn a lot. But also say growing up in Houston, I speaking of the positives that I felt living there, you also see the negatives. This is smog. Houston's a smog capital of one of the country. There's much awareness of that. I definitely remember in the summertime in August when smog is at its worst. I'd like to go for runs at lunchtime, and I'd check sort of the smog stats and just think about whether I should go running or not. I was a bit young and had bad judgment then, so I normally would go anyway. But at least I kind of like began to relate to this being a problem. I think also growing up in Houston, the sort of climate vulnerability. I don't know that I was very aware of this in the 90s, but certainly now it's a city. It's gets decimated by storms in ways that didn't used to happen. This is Hurricane Harvey, widespread flooding, really terrible impact on people and families. So still wasn't quite ready to kind of pursue my environmental interests head on. Decided I wanted to keep learning about the energy industry. Just seeing it's a world where policy and business come together. I wanted to make sure I could learn about the business side. So I went to New York, joined an investment bank doing focused on the energy industry. At that point, it was still energy was oil and gas and refineries and pipelines. The kind of the green parts of the energy industry had not really scaled up quite yet. That was beginning to happen. I was there. I worked in this building right over here. And again, it was an amazing experience in terms of just learning how corporations make decisions, how they think about their big strategy, kind of where they invest capital, just like really understand the capitalism side of energy. This is a great place for me to be able to do that. But really, I wanted to go into the policy side. And as I imagine some of you have encountered, like I was an engineer interested in policy, but it's kind of hard to get a policy job with the background I have. Also as an investment banker, hard to get a policy job. Put in lots of applications, lots of places. I remember applying for jobs at environmental defense fund when I worked at an investment bank. To me, it was like, this is what I'm passionate about, this is what I want to do. I don't know what they thought when they got my resume, but I suspect they're like, this makes no sense. You like worked at Exxon and you're like a Wall Street banker, like what's going on here? So I decided, okay, I guess I'll go to grad school. I think that's I've been kind of pushing that off. I like working, didn't like school so much, but I saw that as being like something that could really bridge me into the next step. So I did a degree in public policy. At that point, I'm like, I'm going straight to the public sector. No more of this private sector stuff. I want to see what the public sector is like. I had no connection to California at that point, except that my then wife by this point was from California, so it was that. But had not lived here before, didn't have professional network here, but did kind of, people had advised me to focus on state government. I thought I would work in international, national kinds of things. And then, I looked at the specific opportunities, sort of small fish in a big pond, and wasn't really seeing the vision of like a trajectory in the federal government or international. And then people advised me to take a look at state government, and started networking with folks. And actually, someone I worked with closely was one of the professors at the Harvard Kennedy School, was very close to Art Rosenfeld, who I saw all right over here, very connected to UC Davis. So he's actually someone I reached out to. I came out to California. He was then a commissioner at the California Energy Commission. Met with Art, who's just an amazing person, an amazing mentor, a very generous person, and also just accomplished so much. And he was very encouraging of working in state government. And he in particular pointed me toward an organization I had not even considered at all, which is the California Public Utilities Commission. Just the name alone was like, that just sounds really boring, terrible. And also I had kind of worked in oil and gas. This was electricity. I'm like a chemical engineer, not an electrical engineer. Like, this is really leveraging my kind of what I've worked on so far. But a number of people said, look at the PUC, look at the PUC. That's kind of where a lot of the real within California activity is. At that point, the environmental aspects of utilities regulation was just taking off. And I kind of got a sense that it was beginning to take off. I wasn't so sure. I was very nervous when I took the job, actually, that it would just be like I would just hate working in government, wrong issues, not a dynamic place. That was all totally wrong. It was an amazing experience, 5 years there. Got to work directly for a commissioner, and at a time when cap and trade regulations were being put in place, California Solar Initiative, renewable portfolio standard being increased, a whole set of policies were kind of being developed and implemented right then. This is a sort of organization, whereas like someone straight out of grad school, you're like working on the real issues and having an impact. And there's other organizations like this also, certainly in California. Air Resources Board, Energy Commission. I'll talk about the ISO a bit later, and other states, other countries. There's all kinds of comparable organizations. Whereas early in your career, you have a big impact. The commissioners I worked for, they kind of left, and as I imagine you've encountered and will continue to encounter, the people you work with are so important. So my sort of small teams I loved working with kind of went away just through the cycle of government. So I kind of opened up to look into other opportunities, and was kind of sucked back to the private sector again for a bit. I got to work for a couple of different energy technology startups. Also living in the Bay Area, hearing about VC startups, like, this sounds kind of cool, maybe I should try this out. Worked for 2 different companies, which Gene mentioned in the intro. One focused on home energy management, one focused on grid sensors. Really great experience. I was helping them think about the impact of policy on the businesses they were trying to create. And that's an area where startups tend to not be very well resourced. They tend to be, it's the technology founders and engineers, but being successful in business requires understanding the policy side. So I learned quite a bit. I think I also kind of realized I very intentionally left the private sector after being there again. I was like, this is comfortable. I like kind of, I seem to be, I'm appreciated here. I can like do well within this organization. Like my career goal is not to be here, is to kind of be more in a public interest area. And then a unique opportunity came along to become the executive director at the Energy Institute at Haas at UC Berkeley. And hopefully you'll have been at least a little bit exposed to it. I hope you do get more exposed to it after this talk. But it's an organization of energy economists, energy and environmental economists, 10 affiliated faculty members, a number of affiliated PhD students. We're not a degree granting program, but they're PhD students that are in other programs affiliated with the Energy Institute, doing a really fascinating applied research, very much an eye toward research that will not only be published in academic journals, but also matters and can affect policy. And in my intro, I said, very much a practitioner. My role is sort of the affect policy part side of the equation. I'm not a researcher, I'm a PhD. I get to dive into topics, but really my role is a lot about this industry-government interaction. So just a few aspects of that. We have a blog, Energy Institute blog. Please subscribe to it here. If you're not already, I highly recommend it. New blog post every Monday, typically written by a faculty member on a different topic, current topic, maybe summarizing some of your research. I imagine all of you will find something in the history of the blog that's been of interest to you. We do public events with focus on the industry and government, but presenting like academic research to that audience. I love actually UC Davis, this institute and others affiliated with it have a lot of the same orientation around connecting to policymakers. Do do webinars. If you join a webinar, you may see me like moderating it or doing a panel discussion. Definitely one of my roles. Gene got to participate in a grad school we had for graduate students around the country. So there's many different aspects to what we do. Pretty much all oriented toward connecting with practitioners. So that's kind of the career part, and happy to talk now or later, but you know, at any sort of, I know you're all at phases in your life, your career is an active area of thinking, and will continue to be. If you see anything in my own background where you're interested in having a conversation, I'm certainly very, very happy to do that. I think kind of a theme that I've really developed over time is I like working at the intersection between the private sector and policy. And I feel like that's where a lot of the real progress, the big things happen in the energy and climate sphere, is when those two things kind of come together. And that's an area where I love working very much. And this what I'm going to go into in my talk is really an example of that just one particular issue that I've gotten deeply involved with recently, where policy and markets are coming together with the private sector and really having a transformative impact and making tremendous climate progress. As Gene mentioned in the intro, about 3 years ago, I started getting involved with Western energy markets, which I'll kind of go into what that means and what I'm talking about in a bit. But I got involved with some committees looking at how those markets are governed. And then after doing that for a couple of years, working with stakeholders from across the Western US, some recommendations were adopted. I had an opportunity to actually join a board, which I'll say more about also in a bit, but it's called the governing body that oversees policies for this Western market. And so the presentation I'm going to give now is really kind of sharing kind of how I'm thinking about what's happening in power markets in the West, hopefully just giving you exposure to this kind of domain, which is its own specialized domain of energy. If you're getting some of you excited about it, it's an area where there's tremendous career potential. And I also think this topic of kind of power markets it's underappreciated for how important it is in climate progress toward addressing climate change. Just as an enabler of progress, really essential enabler of progress on addressing climate change, especially given how pivotal the electric grid is. So I'm going to start first few slides talking about geography to begin to set this up. And I imagine some of you have seen graphs similar to this, but I'm going to make a point by going through this. So I think the future, we hope, of electricity in the United States is a carbon-free grid. So that's raises a lot of questions. How do we get to that? So we go through a few of like the low carbon sources, zero carbon sources of energy, and thinking about the geography of these sources is really important when we get to the markets discussion. So this is solar irradiance, where there's potential for solar energy production. Not surprisingly, it tends to be in the Southwest, in the desert regions, and it's not everywhere. It's some places and not other places. Wind, similar. In this case, it's the dark blue is the highest wind potential. The lighter colors there's less wind potential. So it's the wind potential right here, middle of the U.S. Some intriguing areas off the coast here on the West Coast, off the coast, other coasts also. But again, it's not spread evenly. Wind and solar, extremely attractive sources of zero carbon energy, given how much progress there's been on the technology. Costs have gone down so much. So they're they're technologies that are already having a big impact. They have a much bigger impact. They're not available everywhere. Hydroelectric power, similar story for its own obvious reasons. This graph is showing where the actual generation of hydroelectric power is. I think in the United States, it's kind of safe to say we're not going to see new dams and hydroelectric power. So this is kind of like it's only going to go down from here over time. But it's also very localized. Certain areas, of course, the Pacific Northwest jumps out, big source of hydroelectric power. There's also kind of the geography of on the policy side. You don't need to read the specifics on here, but this is just a map showing that green energy policies have really proliferated across the Western US. I mean, California having a 60% renewable energy mandate by 2030, 100% by 2045. Nevada has an aggressive goal, Oregon has an aggressive goal, Washington has an aggressive goal, just started the cap and trade, about to start cap and trade framework. Even states you might not think of as being aggressive on the environment do have goals. And even in these gray states, there's individual utilities that are adopting very aggressive goals for green energy. So there's like this widespread clean energy goals across the Western US. In many cases, these are relatively new. Even when they're not new, they're getting much more aggressive in the coming decade. So there's a lot of there's the resource potential, it's some places, not others. There's some big goals. I think where the challenges, getting toward the challenges, which is kind of marching toward the markets discussion. So one is the engineering challenge, a historical engineering challenge in the United States, where the US grid is actually 3 grids. These grids have very, very limited connections. Within each of these colored areas, they're extremely interconnected, lots of transmission lines. Everything is electrical terms kind of synchronized, like the sort of sinusoidal wave of alternating current is identical within the red area. It's identical within the blue area, identical within the green area, but not, but they're different between these areas. And there's very few connections across them. If you kind of think back to those graphs charts before, that kind of immediately points to some challenges around the clean energy goals, and the wind energy is kind of cut in half between the red and the blue, and the green. Actually, wind is in all of them. Solar, mostly in the red, not so much in the blue, some in the green. Hydro is also cut up between them. But this is one of the realities of the American grid. I think around the world, there's often some version of this challenge. It varies. I mean, generally in US is somewhat unusual. Actually, usually when countries are like contiguous and connected, they kind of line up on the same grid. The US does have these divisions despite being a continuous territory. Just like curiosity, I mean, Japan is one of the strangest ones of all. They actually have half the country operates at 60 hertz, half it operates at 50 hertz. Just for like the decisions that were made 100 years ago in Japan, they bought their first generator from, maybe it was like General Electric, and in Kyoto, they bought their first generator from like a German manufacturer. So they brought in the European standard, the US standard, and it still exists in this way. But it's kind of, it's important to be aware of any environment. There could be these sort of engineering barriers. Also, just a little more kind of setting up the Western US in particular and why it's a very interesting and challenging area for the power market is looking at economic growth. I was kind of stunned when I found these statistics. If you look at sort of the rankings of the United States in terms of their GDP, state GDP growth, in the top 10, which are listed here, 7 of them are in the Western United States, which is great. That's a very positive thing. And people are doing well, jobs, opportunities. But then thinking about the electrical side of things, those goals, those aggressive green energy goals are happening in an environment where overall demand is increasing. So that kind of adds a dimension to the kind of the greening of the grid challenge. So this is looking at historical data, 2011 to 2021. So it's Washington, Utah, California are the top 3 here. Faster growing than Texas. Texas, I don't think it's number 1, but it's number 4 over that time frame. But something not reflected here from the electricity issue is there's a process of electrification that is just starting, electrifying vehicles, electrifying buildings. Analysis on what that's gonna look like is still in early days. I just led a panel discussion 2 days ago on this topic, and even on that panel of experts, there's basically people are looking into it. But probably the impact of electrification on overall demand could be an increase of 20%, 30%, 40% on top of existing electricity demand. So the energy goals, but increasing demand, growing economies, demand even increasing further. Say a bit more about sort of getting more into sort of the challenges side of managing an electric grid, again, sort of building toward why markets are important. So electricity is not surprising, but electricity demand varies dramatically. It varies dramatically over the course of a day. It varies dramatically over a year. This, just to orient you, is one depiction of this. There was some analysis prepared by the California ISO. So this is for the majority of the state of California. Coming down this way, each one of these is a month, January through September. This is the load, so the amount of total demand on the grid. 20,000 megawatts here, 50,000 megawatts here. You'll see in January, actually and this is a frequency distribution, the frequency, not electrical frequency, how often the demand is in this particular spot. So in January, actually, demand doesn't vary a lot from the night to day, coldest day to warmest day. It's kind of a temperature is more this January, at least 2022. Temperature didn't vary a ton. That's the reason I'm saying temperature. This temperature is the biggest driver of electricity demand, both for air conditioning and heat. It's not the only driver, but it's a lot of where the variability comes. So not a lot of variability in January. Get down to September, where we had an extreme heat wave. You all got all kinds of notifications on your phones and everywhere else. You can see just over the course of September, you had hours of 20,000 megawatts, you had hours of over 50,000 megawatts. Huge variability. So from a engineering standpoint, the grid needs to have sufficient generation and transmission capacity to, for the easy days, but also for the hardest, the most challenging day. And if you can imagine, if California ISO had to do this all on its own, then you would have, if you look at say January, it's maybe 30,000 megawatts is the high. You have sort of from 20,000 plus megawatts. They're just kind of hanging out in January and February, March. You have them there ready to go, but they just hang out most of the year. Then every once in a while, some of them start operating, and a few more operate this month, more operate this month. And then, there's the last few power plants that would only operate a couple hours a year. That would be if it was really California operating as an island. Just a little bit more first on the temperature issue here. So that variability, this is today's California. It's the weather we had this September. Who knows what future Septembers will be like. Also on the consumer side, it's changing. People are responding to this heat, and coastal California, where air conditioning penetration is still quite low, people are putting in air conditioning. So Lucas Davis, a professor at Berkeley, did some analysis looking at air conditioning penetration across the country. Some new data just came out at a national level allowing some analysis of this. And he did kind of looking at, this here is the 10 least air-conditioned states in the US. And so the novelty of Alaska, only 7% air conditioning. But from a grid standpoint, they're not part of the grid challenge we're talking about. They have their own problems. But if you look at that list of states, 5 of the least air-conditioned states are in the West. In Washington, 47% of households lack air conditioning, 24% in Oregon, 28% in California, I think there's definitely concern now that maybe with these heat waves we had recently, these numbers begin to change, and you have more people adopting air conditioning. They're probably not just going to use them on that hottest day of the year. They'll probably use them other days also. They'll be more comfortable. It's good. Air conditioning is like a climate adaptation. One people to take from the standpoint of their health, but from the standpoint of the electric grid, to be one more source of increased demand, and a particularly variable source of increased demand.
Do they only include the central air conditioning unit or like portable?
This data is including both of the kind of room air conditioners or the window air conditioners, as well as the central air. So even within this, there could be another whole layer of if even among, say, the California people with air conditioning, if today they mostly have room air conditioners, they just air condition part of their homes, and in the future they decide, oh, this is like, we're gonna get a lot more heat, so I'm gonna replace the room air conditioner with the central air conditioner. You can even, within air conditioner ownership, go step up potentially. So I mean, generally within the West, there's increasing demand, but there are all the ingredients exist in the West to make tremendous progress toward a carbon-free grid. There's resource potential, there's clean energy policies, and sort of the engineering response to kind of how to make it all work, especially this geographic challenge, this sort of spatial challenge, is we need transmission, just the physical connections across from the resource-rich areas to the demand, and kind of weave it all together with transmission. And I think that's accurate, and there is transmission quite a bit across the West today. Definitely a need for a lot more, but we're going to talk about like where things get messier and why it's really not just an engineering challenge. So here's really getting into the messiness of the Western US. So I showed you before, there are sort of 3 grids across the United States. Actually, the Western US, that's from an engineering standpoint, there's 3 grids. But from kind of how the West has organized itself historically, or kind of developed organically historically, there are actually 38, not grids, but there's 38 entities that each are responsible for meeting the demand for energy in their own zone. These are known as balancing authority areas, the balancing authorities, these entities. They're generally utilities, the kind of historical utility that came about in a particular region. Sometimes it's a cluster of several utilities. It's an extremely complex environment, and it's actually a uniquely complex environment. The Eastern United States, I'll show a picture in a little bit, they actually reorganized themselves about 20 years ago, and kind of created institutions that bridged across their version of these entities. Western US has not done that so far, and I can speak a bit to why they haven't, but also things are beginning to happen. So each one of these entities plans for transmission independent. There's no master plan. Like the wind here, solar here, in theory, you connect this to here, this to here, and you can kind of get the clean energy to the demand. There's no entity that has that responsibility. There's no entity that even could do that, has the authority to do that. Some of this gets to the complex kind of federalism of the United States, where so much power is, the federal government is given to the states, especially around electricity. Now, there is a lot of trading, though. There's tons of trading, sharing of electricity, or trading is sort of the financial version of that, across the region. There are transmission lines that cross these different colored areas, and there's power that moves back and forth. That's been very critical to the Western United States for 100 years. But historically, it's been a very kind of coarse and manual process. It's owner of, so BPAT, Bonneville is a federal entity, they have a lot of dams. They can be like, hey, we have some extra hydropower. There's a lot of rain this spring, we have some hydropower. We could sell it down to Arizona where they, it's already hot, in April, and the air conditioning demand is increasing. The way that works today is someone at Bonneville in the control room or the trading desk calls up someone in APS, the trading desk, and says, hey, we have some power, you want some power? They kind of work out a transaction. There's certain standards for how that happens. But it's very what they call bilateral. It's a buyer needs to find a seller. But not just like the buyer and the seller, then they also need to make sure they've identified owners of transmission lines that go from up there to down here and have paid for the rights to use those transmission lines to kind of schedule this line, okay, get the power all the way down. So it's a very cumbersome process. It works, but as I'll show in a minute, there's much better ways to do this. And it's particularly difficult, this bilateral situation with wind and solar, intermittent energy sources, that they don't operate when an operator decides to operate. You can't necessarily say, I'm going to sell you some wind power tomorrow at this exact amount for these exact hours. You can kind of forecast it, you can guess, but you can't sort of guarantee delivery of it. Certainly not a season ahead of time or a year ahead of time. So the bilateral was very poorly suited for a renewable energy future. Now, a wide-ranging group of Western market participants and other stakeholders have concluded, fortunately, that the region needs more cooperation through strong institutions. Coordinating the operation of power plant, both to kind of coordinate the operation of power plants, the development of new plants, development of the transmission grid, because all working together on these things can increase reliability, lower costs, and reduce the environmental impacts across the West. There's, at last, there's some kind of, over the last 8 years, the real recognition, there's opportunity. We need to work together, and we're going to start doing that. Yes.
I have a, my name is Peter, I'm a first-year master's student. I have a question about the specific mechanism for power trading. You referenced, the balancing authorities are trading power. Are they, but obviously it comes from a generator. The generators aren't trading directly with the power authority, it's power authority of power authority, or balancing authority of balancing authority. And they're just selling the power from the power pool that their generators are obligated to fill, right? They're not actually calling up generator A and saying, hey, we want to buy X amount and we're going to send it here, right? They just have a pool that they're sending back. Right?
So it's good question. And that gets to some of the complexity. There's all kinds of arrangements. Okay. So there's not a kind of one answer to that, basically. In some cases, it's this entity owns all of the generation in their area. They are actually deciding what plants to turn off and on. They're kind of working through their trading desks. There's other situations where there's power plant here under contract to someone over here, the contractual rights cross these boundaries. California is unusual where there actually are fully autonomous power plants, which are voluntarily themselves participating in the market. So it's quite a variety of trading arrangements and financial arrangements. So now I'm going to talk about this organization that I'm now on the governing body of, Western Energy Imbalance Market. This is the first real move toward kind of knitting together the West through markets, and it's been extremely successful. It's been up and running for about 8 years. There are utilities that the map looks different, but it's basically the same. It's a more precise depiction of those blobs. But there are utilities that serve 80% of customers across the Western US are now participating in this particular market. So this market in particular is this is where I hope I don't go too much in the weeds on this stuff, trying to keep the right level. But the weeds are really interesting too. So I hope you want to do anything with it. So this market is looking at the real-time trades of power. You know, there are trades of power that happen, contracts that are signed 10 years ahead of time. There's trades that are happening 1 year ahead of time. There's even trades that are happening just 1 day ahead of time. But where the first area where everyone sort of agreed to work together is on real time. So this is like the trading of power during the next 15 minutes, basically. And the way the market works, roughly, is that each one of those air balancing authority areas that's participating, they make plans in advance, years in advance, months in advance, days in advance, hours, days in advance, to kind of make sure they have enough power to serve all of their customers. Everyone kind of does that. Then they all come to this market and they say, this is our demand, here's our supply portfolio we put together, here are the costs of those different power plants that we have lined up. Then the market is really a software. It's a complex kind of software optimization machine. It basically takes all this information. It knows what the transmission grid looks like, which kind of determines where power can move across the Western United States. Then it basically looks for like the lowest cost solution. It's like, okay, well, what if we, instead of taking this power plant you've lined up ahead of time that has, let's say, a high cost, where there's other power plant that someone else instead is available that has a lower cost, we'll kind of, you won't need to run that plant, the expensive plant as much. The less expensive plant will operate more. This is happening hundreds and hundreds of times each 15-minute interval. Dozens of plants, hundreds of plants are being kind of, low-cost ones are operating a little more, high-cost ones are being operated a little bit less. And then the net result is there's still enough power going on the grid to satisfy demand, but it's at a lower cost. And so far, the market has produced nearly $3 billion in cost savings since it began in 2014. And I was describing that bilateral process. Like basically, the way I think about it is that bilateral process missed $3 billion worth of opportunities. There were like buyers and sellers that if they had found each other, they could have found this value in theory. But when the grid is so complex, sometimes these increments are very small, and you don't necessarily. It's just too burdensome to kind of have this bilateral interaction for very small increments. But they add up. So here's one depiction of kind of what happens through this energy imbalance market. These are, over here, are sellers of electricity. So the pink one is the California ISO. Pacific Core, there's a few other ones. It doesn't matter so much who they are. And then these are the buyers. And the main thing I thought this graphic showed very clearly is there's power going in a lot of different places. It's not just, it's far from bilateral. There's many, many different interactions happening here. This is the second quarter, which is an interesting time of the year because that's when, so it's spring, the sun is shining, the wind is blowing, California is producing a ton of energy. But it's still very cool here. Air conditioning load is not very high here, but it is in Las Vegas and Phoenix and some other places. So California is a huge exporter of electricity in the spring. And this wasn't happening before this market existed. Instead, what was happening is, and unfortunately still happening, is renewable curtailment, where there's too much wind or solar, usually solar, relative to the local demand. And so the power plant operator would just tell the solar farms to turn off, which obviously is not what we want in terms of sort of addressing climate problems. This graph is showing total curtailment in the California ISO. The little blue bit at the top is reduction in the curtailment due to this market. So there's still tall gray bars here, but there is significant decrease in that curtailment just due to the market. And this is given the current transmission system. Really, the way to get at the rest of the gray bar is building more transmission. So then building more transmission plus this market can make more of this curtailment go away. Also, that's not the only thing, also energy storage is another really important competing approach to reduce the renewable curtailment. Another thought here, not thinking of right now, but I just want to say, like, cost minimization, I was speaking of before, the market, by cost minimizing, it brings these opportunities to the table, because the marginal cost of wind production, of solar production is zero. So I think there's some people who are kind of skeptical of markets, and they'll say this is just about money. It's just like making money. Some people making more money. That's kind of all about financial. But this is a case where, I mean, the financial implications are environmental implications. You know, more low-cost energy means cleaner energy.
No, sorry.
Is there another?
Less later.
I think we're not too far from totally open things up. So next step, which I'm not going to go into much detail in, but so these kind of Western stakeholders have had a great experience with this market. Actually, before I get to this, what is, you know, why has this market been so successful? There was 100 years of like very little progress in this direction, basically. As I said, that was in contrast to other parts of the US where 25 years ago, there were big efforts to create new centralized multi-state markets. But that didn't happen in the Western United States, except in California. It did happen in California in the late 90s. There was the creation of the California Independent System Operator, which those little colored blobs I showed, there used to be lots of those blobs within California also. Those were knit together through the California ISO. And I think a lot of what I credit why this market has been so successful is that the California ISO is the operator of these markets. And the California ISO now has 25 successful years of operating these markets. Not all 25 years were successful. Which you point out, a lot of the experience, the early experience was very negative. There was a kind of flawed market design. There was a California Western energy crisis. Professor Jim Bushnell here was among the academic researchers who was kind of pointing out flaws in that design. But that kind of rolled forward in a very flawed way. There was a crisis, huge financial pain. And that actually is one of the reasons this has not happened sooner, is because entities across the West just kind of put up walls. They just said, we don't want to interact in a market like this. We saw how badly this first market went. But now I think the kind of the need for the market is so great with renewable energy, clean energy goals, that these Western entities are slowly kind of working through their discomfort and kind of taking steps in the direction of more and more markets. Yes.
Do you think the instances and frequency of negative pricing is a good diagnostic indicator of how much curtailment is destroying value in the energy markets? And because essentially the reason a lot of prices go negative is not because of how it's, you're making money instead of paying. It's not because markets are operating efficiently, because there are no markets to get the demand to the supply and supply to the demand.
No, absolutely. Negative prices are very correlated with curtailment occurring. I mean, it shows that there's not enough transmission to get the energy to a market. The negative prices are interesting. That means someone's actually taking the negative price. That's usually because of tax credits or something else where they actually, to them, that they still get paid even though the price is negative. But yeah, if there's a negative price there, there's probably lots of curtailment in that same region, is the way I would think about that. Yes.
Are the y-axes, are they meant to be flipped? Sure. Should
the bars are over there. The annual curtailment. The cumulative curtailment is the red, is the orange line.
Yeah, but cumulative avoided curtailment is 1,800 gigawatt hours for May. Even though the energy curtailment, the avoided curtailment, the blue bar for May of 2022 is maybe 100.
I mean, the orange is the sum of the blues The blue bar is kind of summing up as we move across.
Okay.
So over this entire period of time, over this 5-year period of time, actually going to graph.
Oh,
goes
it's
before.
it's a running.
So it's a running
Yeah, yeah.
total over the time the market has existed. Yep. Yeah, also speaking of, it's ISO, I interact a lot with the ISO in this role on the governing body. It's really an amazing organization, just their professionalism, their analytical abilities, they've become very good at stakeholder, working with different stakeholders. As I said, this was kind of an environment where there's a lot of distrust due to history. ISO was at the center of that, the problem. So there was like a lot of distrust aimed at the ISO, but they really bridged that. It's a really, I'm sure there's certainly, just a couple days ago, I met someone from the Davis grad who recently started working in one of their offices there. But it's definitely recommend if you're interested in power markets, look at the ISO from a employment standpoint. They're located in Folsom, just east of Sacramento. So I don't want to take too much more time, so maybe I won't go really into the governance piece of it too deeply, but I can definitely do that. Speaking a little bit more about the governance. So it is, stakeholders outside of the ISO have been uncomfortable with market governance. Even with this new market, they're still very uncomfortable with governance because the market is still ultimately governed by 5 members of the Board of Governors who are appointed by the Governor of California, confirmed by the California State Senate. So if you're an Arizona utility or Idaho utility or a Washington utility, having these market decisions that are very important to you being made by an organization that is ultimately connected to California's politics and government, that makes people very, very nervous. I'm on sort of a parallel board, which used to be like very much a junior board, which is a board that was created specifically for these markets. But as a junior board in the sense that anything the board I'm on did could be kind of overridden by the more political California-centric board. There's some recent reforms. So, but despite that concern, like 80% of the load of the West start participating in this market. The value is so great, they're willing to put up with the risk of sort of California political influence, partly because they can leave the market at any point. It's a voluntary market. But also, I think it's been comforting. There have been changes now, so the board I'm on is at the same level, more or less, in terms of the way decisions are made as the other board. Still, California politics are very influential, but there's a bit more equality. So I have to be the one person on my 5-member board with a California background. The rest of them are from other parts of the Western United States. Former retired utility exec from Arizona, from Oregon, environmentalist from Utah, as well as someone from Idaho. It was super very much Western stakeholders feel comfortable that there's a lot of geographic diversity on that panel. I think they're a little nervous about me actually because I was another California person and there's always a part of this California board. But the nice thing about being an academic institution is I have a more independence associated with me, not sort of kind of corporate interests. So the next effort is to kind of create another market, which kind of moves one day earlier in the process. That may sound like a funny distinction, but that means a lot in the world of power markets, where going from real-time market to actually day-ahead market. That's a time period when real decisions are being made. Like, as I said, in the real-time market, everyone's kind of lined up their resources ahead of time, and then there's a re-optimization that happens in real time. Day-ahead market is actually when some of the primary buying and selling is happening, and there's more opportunity for optimization. Certain power plants, many power plants, have to kind of ramp up over time, ramp down over time. So be able to optimize over a period of time can unlock a lot more value. Not going to go into what these are, but it does raise issues that are about how resources are counted in this market, how transmission is utilized in the market, how different entities kind of get compensated for transmission. Also, an issue I haven't mentioned, there's a greenhouse gas accounting issue. One of the complexities in the US with the federalist system is we have like United States has no cap and trade or carbon pricing overall. California does, Washington's about to. That means we want to make sure that in California that a coal or natural gas power plant is sort of penalized in the market for the costs associated with carbon emissions. Other parts of the Western US do not. Wyoming is never going to have a price on carbon, for example. So the market needs to kind of take that into account. How do you kind of make sure you're not, in a sense, sending coal generation or natural gas generation excessively into these areas that are putting a price on carbon? So there's complexities around how you kind of bring the price into this multi-state market.
Just a clarifying question, in the current 15-minute
Real time.
real-time market, does the carbon accounting happen right now for electricity coming into California?
Yes, there is a version of this. This issue has also been worked through for the real time market. So there is a attempt. And then kind of the next step where everyone really wants to go, many market participants would really like to go, is toward a regional transmission organization. So I mentioned in the eastern United States, 25 years ago, they kind of reorganized themselves. So these are each one of these colors is like a multi-state. These states got together and created a market. These did also PJM. PJM goes into Chicago. So there's several of these where the utilities, power plants, and everyone else kind of went through really difficult negotiations, figured out how to kind of put together one market. There's one process for planning transmission lines. So what I was talking about before, there's no unified process of how do you get the wind from the middle of the country to the population centers. Well, there is within these zones, they actually do plan jointly, and these have been many of them very successful and around for quite a while. California has this type of design. It's been very helpful within the boundaries of the state where that market exists. But now there's conversations starting about how do we do this across this gray area, this kind of this other area that's kind of has problems with other. Different though, they have like one monopoly that controls it. But here it's like 38 entities. So those discussions are underway. I mean, governance is one of the major issues there. You can't have a sort of California governor-appointed group that governs the entire Western United States, obviously. So that needs to kind of be worked through. There's other forms of flavors of opposition too that I'd be happy to talk about. And I think, forming an RTO could really kind of supercharge clean energy development across the Western US. It could really, it's where the process to get to the RTO would have gone through a lot of the negotiations we need to figure out how are we going to get wind from Wyoming and Montana into California, or how are we going to get solar energy from Arizona up to Portland. Like all these issues would be kind of worked out in the setup of that framework, and then once it's set up, development can happen at a much more rapid pace. We see that in California. Like PG&E in Northern California develops solar and wind projects in Southern California. So not even an issue. It's just they know it's the same grid that they're on. ISO. There's the rules for how you pay for transmission, how people get compensated for the energy. That's all been worked out, well understood, and this development happens wherever it's most optimal. Instead of California trying to do Northern California utilities trying to develop all the resources in Northern California. So I'll just say overall, I'm very excited about the trend toward more collaboration in the West. The region's electricity sector has many challenges, but there's growing agreement toward working together toward a solution. This will require big human resource commitments. There's big opportunities to work in this area. I will say, like every entity is hiring in this area. You want to work in any state in the Western United States, you probably work on Western market integration. In fact, California ISO is having a big problem with their people being pushed away very actively by the entities in Arizona, Utah, and everywhere else, because they all need this expertise. But I'm very, very optimistic about where things are headed. And with that, thank you. Happy to answer.
Yeah, could you please elaborate again on the difference between the Western market integration that you talked about and the RTO, because in the RTO map, like, I kind of miss like the why some states are missing or why some of the balancing authorities are missing in that. So what is the benefit that is going to RDO from what we have now with the Western market integration plus the day ahead market? What is more achieved with the RDO?
Yeah, it's a great question. That is the question that stakeholders are asking and need answers to themselves before making a decision. And one of the key things is around this sort of joint transmission planning. Transmission, it's already, there's sort of across the West billions of dollars spent per year on transmission. Probably, like, saw a presentation 2 days ago from one of our faculty. I mean, probably need 5-fold to 10-fold of that rate of spending. But I think with the RTO, one, you can kind of, today there's lines that can't even get built because crossing these two, a very common issue that comes up with building transmission lines is what's called cost allocation. So every transmission line, there's beneficiaries and there's, but given the complexity of the way electricity travels, it's very difficult to determine and agree upon who the beneficiaries are, because the desire today is like wanting to align the costs, like the who pays for the line should be who benefits from the line. That sounds very nice, but it's very difficult to determine. Everyone disagrees. No one wants to pay. Everyone wants to say someone else benefits. So these lines just don't get built at all in a lot of cases. With an RTO, those lines would get built because there would be an agreement on how costs are being allocated. In California, the framework is, use the term of peanut butter, but like basically the costs are spread across the entire state. So a transmission line from San Diego into the Imperial Valley in Southern California, that line is paid for, that cost of that line is added to a fee that everyone in the state pays for transmitting power.
Quiet.
So there's the cost allocation issue would be addressed. Some more lines can get built that are just stuck right now. And then also just sort of more optimization of which lines to build. There's also a concern like today, in the absence of joint planning, that even some lines that are getting built aren't really the most valuable ones to get built. Kind of like, utilities like to build power lines because they make profits from building a line. And so today, I mean, PG&E has every incentive to just propose every line possible within California. If someone will approve it, they'll just build it. But with an RTO, there's kind of some discipline around that and kind of decision making around making sure that the best lines are built.
So those colored maps that you showed are people who are in for the RDO? Is that what that meant, the last slide?
Let's see, I put a bunch of color maps.
It's the last one we showed.
The very last one was today's RTOs across the country. This one, yeah. So all those, there's a primary graphical colored blobs. All those entities do not belong to an RTO. They just are operating as autonomous areas. There used to be multiple blobs in here, but now they do operate as one RTO. Yeah.
Where do you think deregulation in other Western states plays in like an RTO adoption? Do you bring more sellers and buyers, on a free market? Does that encourage more bringing in like a central balancing authority like an RTO or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, deregulation's important here. I will say some of the big advocates for an RTO in the West, among the advocates, are the independent power producers, sort of the term is what it sounds like. So entities that own power plants, but they're not utilities. They're kind of developers of power plants. They like, especially the renewable developers, they like an RTO because it creates a market that they can sell their power into. In the absence of an RTO, they're beholden to the local utility, basically. So you kind of, if you want to develop a wind project in the Bonneville area, you need to convince Bonneville to buy your wind project, to buy your power. More or less. But with an RTO, it opens up opportunities for the trade more trading, basically. You're not beholden to your local utilities.
How does the differing CFE goals, 60, 80, whatever, across states impact the formation of the RTO? And like, do you
CFE.
is it carbon-free energy, right? So 60% by 2030 for California, or well, 60% renewable, but CFE would be the next is impact the formation of an RTO. And do you have to reconcile all those different goals? Otherwise, okay, creating full RTO, California's like, we want to be 60 or 80%, right? But we're getting natural gas from Arizona or Utah or whatnot, right? And that's impacting like the power mix within the state itself. So how do you think about that element of it if states have differing power content rules within the RTO?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm trying to answer. I'm not super expert in every ins and outs of kind of clean energy, carbon-free energy goals, but so certainly the accounting is critical. Not the accounting I was talking about before, greenhouse gas accounting, but the accounting for compliance with a given state's renewable portfolio standard or clean energy standard. That's very important. It's also very important that there's kind of shared account, kind of basically shared books across the states, which my understanding is that there has been quite a bit of development on that, because this issue of having different states, different goals, that's been around for a while, preceding this conversation. And so I know California sort of led the way in creating Regis, I don't remember what that acronym stands for, but basically like an accounting book for tracking renewable generation and making sure there's real clarity around this wind farm, this output from this wind farm is associated with this buyer. And the buyer, that's the regulated entity under the RPS. And so if that, so you can be confident that it's only being counted once. I guess the double counting is a big concern. My understanding, my familiarity, which may not be total, is that those types of rules tend to be focused on the load serving entity and looking at what they're purchasing, as opposed to just looking at the net power content for geography. That's also, we hope that those at some level match up, but
I have no understanding. So, as within the hypothetical RTO that might exist, you would have states, let's say California, is willing to pay more for carbon-free electricity. So say they want a whole bunch of geothermal in Utah now, and so buy a bunch of that, and for our overnight, 9 to 8 a.m. whatever, right? When we don't have wind or solar, and California is willing to pay for that, right? The LSUs, because they have RPS to fill, they have goals to fill, and so they would be paying a higher. They'd be paying a higher price per kilowatt hour versus like maybe the LSE in Utah who wants that. So is there a scenario where you integrate, but then all of like the carbon-free power sources are going to markets that are willing to pay more, and then you're leaving some of the smaller markets or load centers who are like, well, crap, we can't buy this, we have to rely on this gas plant because that's the cheapest electricity we can get, because an IPP doesn't want to, IPP can go get a higher price elsewhere.
yeah, well, so there's sort of the supply and demand. I think this is a bit outside of the real-time market issue. At least part of it is there's the supply and demand for clean energy in general. And it is the case that, California has had the most aggressive goals, the earliest, most aggressive goals. They cause the prices of renewable energy to increase around the West have historically. And if you're kind of the second or third state that comes along with aggressive goals, you're coming into that market. Fortunately, the cost though of those resources have gone down so much. There seems to be lots of space and potential to develop more projects. I guess that's where a lot of the response is just on the supply side. That if the price you're gonna prices of renewable energy rise very high, more renewable energy developers come into the market and develop their projects because they can make money. So that kind of brings the price back down. I think now, as I'm just sort of talking through this out loud, but in the late 2000s was the PUC, there was very much some scarcity of renewable energy and prices were really at a premium. But I feel like now there's so many places you can build such low cost renewable energy that actual cost of the generation is really keeping those prices lower. Yes.
So this question is kind of related to what you and Peter were talking about, but I'm seeing some of these states up here, like Washington has a really heavy standard for clean energy by 2045, and then Arizona also has a really heavy clean standard. So I'm interested to know, are you seeing, with these really aggressive clean energy targets, are you seeing a push for developing more of these RTOs? Because I feel like that would be more of an effective system to actually transmit this clean energy under the umbrella of these new super aggressive policies. But I'm just, like, I can't wrap my head around it because a lot of these states that have these aggressive policies, I mean, I haven't even heard talk about RTO development. So I'm curious, like, is the system in place already effective enough to supply those goals? Or do you think there's going to be a shift in the coming years?
Are there states in particular where you have in mind where you haven't heard about?
I mean, I'm from Washington, so I haven't really heard much. Maybe I'm just not aware, but I have not heard much about it.
So it's it's just sort of like real-time conversations there. So let's say the conversations are happening. They haven't been happening for very long. And I think especially like Washington, Pacific Northwest, definitely a region that was very shell-shocked by the California energy crisis of the 2000-2001. And they were among the slower to kind of enjoy this real-time market, Bonneville in particular. But the conversations are happening now. They're extremely active at the sort of market participant level, meaning like the power plant developers and the NGOs that kind of work in those kind of sandboxes and the utilities. Not the political conversation is just starting, so it actually just really got kicked off last legislative cycle. Both the state of Nevada and the state of Colorado passed bills that require that those states join an RTO by 2030. That just happened. It's thought that that's in part because they're trying to, it's like a kick in the pants to California. Because in California, there are competing proposals out there. There's the one I'm associated with, it's kind of California ISO-centric. There's also, this is the road I have. So this entity here, Southwest Power Pool, they're in the Eastern Interconnect, but they've decided to kind of like try to push into this territory. So they've actually created a real-time market that has the Colorado utilities in it. And they are also kind of working on a competing RTO proposal. And so there's also this bit of this competitive dynamic. So when Colorado and Nevada pass a law that says we need to join an RTO by 2030, if California just sits on its butt until 2030 and this guy, SPP, they set up an RTO, then those utilities in those states are going to be like, we have a law here. There's an option with SPP, there's not one with California, so we're going to join SPP. And then in California, there was this legislative session that just ended it's called a concurrent resolution. It's not a law, but it's kind of an expression of policy that they've passed unanimously, basically asking the ISO to look at the cost and benefits of creating an RTO. And that's thought to be like the first step toward the political part of the conversation in California.
How does permitting, transmission permitting improve under an RTO, given that FERC still has authority for certain permitting aspects across state lines? Is there so that's the first part, but the second part is then, does any, like within the IRA, there's tax credits for permitting, for transmission construction, or is there subsidies for it? How does that improve like that outlook for forming an RTO over the long term?
Yeah, so sort of getting lines built, permitting around that. What's our time?
Oh, we have like 5 minutes.
Okay. So I got to work on several siting cases, transmission siting cases when I was at the PUC. And those are very, very challenging cases. In part, they become like permitting cases are sort of Trojan horses for other interests that people who, and also just for NIMBYs, just people who just don't, they live near where the lines are being built, they don't just want it to be built there. They all participate actively in the permitting process, trying to shut things down. Where I think the RTO is helpful, I do think an RTO is helpful. For one, there's that, I referenced before, there's a transmission planning process. So one of the big issues of permitting, so if you don't want a transmission line in your backyard, you're not going to say, I don't want a transmission line in my backyard. You're going to say, we don't need that transmission line. It's unnecessary. That's like typically the arguments that will be articulated. If you have a transmission planning process for a region, that process is, those kinds of processes identify lines that are needed. Like, you know, California does this internally. Over the next 10 years, 20 years, given energy goals of the state, they do some analysis, a big stakeholder process to determine lines are needed here, 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 here. So then when you get to the permitting process, if you're going to propose to build one of those lines, you can say, look, there's this very robust statewide process involving everybody, everyone can participate, determine there is a line needed between point A and point B. And then when you have sort of the pushback on the line, that kind of gives more credibility. But like, you know, this from the standpoint of like grid need, the case has been made already, this line is needed. FERC in particular, and FERC tends to, they're one of the sidelines actually of transmission permitting. I mean, there are other federal agencies in the West, there's also federal land. There's those entities get involved. I'll say in general, FERC is they're very active in the Eastern United States, but in the West, they love RTOs. FERC loves RTOs, but but people in the West hate FERC. so FERC is being very strategic and being not talking about how much they love RTOs that much, because they're like their endorsement could be like a curse in the Western United States. So they kind of are hanging back and just letting the stakeholders kind of work through it, but they're very supportive in the background for RTO being closed. Other questions or comments?
Well, I think we're just about out of time, so, yeah. Let's give another round of applause.